She still remembered the sound of the old bus doors slamming shut, that hollow metal echo that bounced around the set of Speed. Back then, Sandra was all nerves and adrenaline, trying to prove she belonged in a world of giant cameras and bigger egos. She'd show up early, stay late, and rehearse her lines in the trailer until the words blurred together. Success was important, but what really scared her was failing in front of the people she respected. And at the top of that list, quietly, was Keanu. He wasn't what she expected, not the loud, swaggering action star you might imagine. He moved through the chaos of the set with a kind of gentle focus, like he was always listening for something softer than the explosions and stunts happening around them. When the director yelled, when producers argued, Keanu stayed calm. He carried his own coffee, held the door for crew members, remembered people's names. One afternoon, after a long, exhausting shoot, she watched him sit with a background extra who looked shaken from a stunt. No cameras were rolling. No one important was watching. But Keanu listened, nodded, and didn't leave until the guy was smiling again. That quiet kindness caught her off guard. They joked a lot, almost too much. Between takes, Sandra would tease him about his serious expressions, and he'd mock frown and say, "I'm acting." He liked her quick wit. She liked his soft laugh that came a second late, as if he wanted to fully feel the joke before reacting. But under the banter, she felt something dangerous growing. A warmth every time he looked at her a second too long, a tiny ache when he walked away to reset for another shot. She told herself it was normal, just set chemistry, the kind that disappears when the lights go out. Still, when she went home at night, she found herself replaying small moments instead of big scenes. One evening, after a long day of close calls and stunt rehearsals, she stayed behind to run lines alone. The studio was half dark, echoing with distant footsteps and the thud of equipment being moved. Her throat was tight from hours of acting like her life was in danger, and underneath that pretend fear was a very real one. What if they wrapped the movie, and nothing in her real life felt as electric as these days with him? She was so caught up in her thoughts she didn't hear the door open. "You okay?" he asked, voice low, almost careful. She turned to see him standing by the doorway, jacket over his shoulder, hair still damp from the makeup department trying to tame it. He looked tired but present, like she was the only reason he hadn't already gone home. "I'm fine," she lied, shrugging. "Just trying not to mess up tomorrow." He walked closer, that thoughtful frown appearing again. "You never mess up," he said. "You just try again." The way he said it wasn't cheesy, wasn't flirty. It was simple, honest encouragement, and something inside her chest loosened. She laughed to break the tension, tossing back a line about how he clearly hadn't watched her first 3 takes that morning. He smiled, but he didn't deny it. Instead, he picked up her script from the table, glanced at it, and said softly, "We can run it together if you want." They read the lines slowly, their characters arguing about danger and risk and trust, but somewhere along the way the words stopped feeling like fiction. Every time she looked up at him, she could see something flicker in his eyes. Respect, admiration, maybe the same. What if that was starting to haunt her? When they finished, the silence that followed felt heavy and fragile, like glass so thin one wrong word could shatter it. She wanted to say it, "I like you," not just on screen, not just in this story we're pretending to live. But then she remembered all the things that could go wrong, rumors, power imbalances, the way Hollywood chews up quiet, private feelings and sells them as headlines. She wasn't sure if she was brave enough to turn a perfect working relationship into a messy real one. So she smiled too brightly, clapped the script closed, and made a joke about needing sleep more than romance. He hesitated just a fraction, as if he'd been holding on to some unspoken sentence and now had to let it go. "You were great today," he said instead. "You always are." Then he put the script down, gave her that small, careful nod he did when words felt too big, and walked toward the door. As the door clicked shut behind him, the room felt bigger and emptier all at once. She pressed her back against the table, staring at the script that still held the warmth of his hands, and realized the truth she hadn't wanted to name. This wasn't just a little on-set crush. This was the beginning of something she might never forgive herself for leaving unspoken. And she had no idea that, on the other side of that door, Keanu had paused in the hallway, staring at the floor, silently asking himself the same terrifying question. What if I just walked away from the one person who really sees me? He always said the end of a movie feels like the last day of school. Everyone promises to stay in touch, but life has its own script. And when speed finally wrapped, that's exactly what it felt like. A blur of hugs, laughter, and a heavy, unspoken sadness underneath. Sandra watched the crew pack away the world they'd built together, the bus, the props, the explosions that had somehow become normal. But what she really watched from the corner of her eye was him. Keanu shaking hands, thanking people individually, taking his time like he knew this moment wouldn't come back. They took photos together, arms around each other, smiling big Hollywood smiles. "We'll work together again," someone said. "Of course they will, they're perfect on-screen," another joked. Sandra laughed along, but a small voice inside her whispered, "What if this is it? What if this is the closest you'll ever get to him?" She pushed the thought away, telling herself that if something was meant to happen, it would. That's what people say when they're scared to take the first step. That last afternoon, the sun was dipping low, painting the set in gold. She was at her trailer, stuffing half her life into boxes, when there was a knock on the door. She opened it and found him standing there, hands in his pockets, that same thoughtful look she'd come to recognize. For a heartbeat, the noise of the set fell away. "I just wanted to say you were incredible," he said, a little awkward, like he didn't want it to sound like just another compliment. "Working with you, it made everything easier and better." Her first instinct was to hide behind humor. "Careful, Reeves," she said, folding her arms with a smile. "Keep talking like that, and I'll think you actually like me." He smiled, but his eyes didn't joke back. "I do," he replied quietly. "I really do." The air changed. For a moment it felt like they were balanced on the edge of something huge. Her heart pounded, and she knew this could be the moment. All she had to do was push gently forward, ask him to coffee, to dinner, to anything that wasn't lit by studio lights. She opened her mouth to speak, but the door of the trailer behind her slammed, and a voice called her name. Manager, assistant, someone rushing, someone reminding her of schedules and deals and the next big thing. She glanced back for half a second, and that little interruption was all it took for fear to slip in. She turned again to him, now suddenly aware of how many people were still walking past the trailer area, who might see, who might whisper. Her chest tightened. "We'll see each other at events," she said instead, trying to sound casual. "You'll get sick of me." "Promise?" he asked, half smiling. It was light, but there was something heavy underneath, like he was giving her a chance to say more and hoping she'd take it. But she didn't. She thanked him again, they hugged, longer than two co-stars technically needed to, and then he stepped back, gave her that small nod of his, and walked away toward his car. She watched him go, her hand still tingling from where it had rested on his shoulder, a question burning in her chest that she didn't dare ask out loud. Life moved fast after that. Success poured in. New scripts, new directors, red carpets, endless interviews under bright, unforgiving lights. Both of them became busier, their names rising higher on posters, their faces more and more familiar to the world. They saw each other at award shows, always at a distance at first, across a crowded room full of sequins and champagne. Then one of them would catch the other's eye, and suddenly all the noise would drop away for a second. "How are you?" she'd ask, hugging him, breathing in that same calm presence she remembered. "Surviving," he'd reply with a small grin. "You?" "Faking it gracefully," she'd say, and they'd both laugh like only they understood the joke. People speculated, of course. Headlines turned their friendly glances into secret romances, their easy chemistry into rumors. Publicists would warn, "Don't feed it, don't say too much." So they almost overcorrected, keeping a respectful distance in front of cameras, acting as if they were just good colleagues who occasionally crossed paths. But behind the small talk, there was always that quiet, unsolved question: why didn't we ever try? Time, however, is not gentle. Both of them lived through their own storms, losses, heartbreaks, private griefs the world only knew in fragments. Sandra went through nights where the silence of her home felt like a weight pressing on her chest, and she thought of that humble kindness he carried everywhere. Keanu faced tragedies that reshaped the way he moved through the world, made him even softer, even more patient with other people's pain. Every now and then, in their separate loneliness, they'd remember a day on a movie set when life was simpler and the future felt wide open. Years later, they were both invited to a charity event, a quiet one, focused on helping children, no huge red carpet, just a room full of people who'd seen too much and still wanted to do good. Sandra almost didn't go. She was tired, burned out from press, and wary of smiling for cameras when her heart felt heavy. But something in her said yes at the last moment. She put on a simple dress, tied her hair back without too much effort, and told herself she'd stay an hour, then leave. She didn't know he'd be there. She arrived, signed a few posters, shook a few hands, and drifted toward a table covered in photos of kids who needed surgeries, schooling, second chances. Her eyes stung as she read their stories. That was when she felt it. A familiar presence beside her, a quiet space opening up as if the noise of the room had respectfully stepped back. "Still saving the world, one project at a time," a voice murmured gently. She turned, and there he was. Older, of course, lines at the corners of his eyes, a bit more gray in his hair, but carrying the same soft steadiness she remembered from the bus set all those years ago. For a moment, neither of them said anything. The years between them, all that almost and never quite, seemed to hang in the air like dust motes caught in the light. They embraced, and this time the hug wasn't just friendly. It was layered. Relief, nostalgia, something unspoken pulsing underneath. Letting go felt wrong, so they didn't, not right away. When they finally pulled back, they just looked at each other, both silently measuring how much the other had changed and how much they hadn't. "You look good," she said, the word too small for what she meant. "So do you," he answered with a sincerity that made her chest ache. "Really good, happy." The question hit harder than she expected. She took a breath, feeling the rough edge of the truth pressing against her tongue. Happy. Successful, yes. Grateful, yes. But happy, not in the simple, quiet way she had once imagined she might be if she had been braver in that trailer years ago. "I'm figuring it out," she said finally. "You." He nodded slowly. "Same." They spent the evening standing a little apart from everyone else, talking about everything and nothing. Childhood stories, books, the way responsibility feels heavier as you get older. They laughed, really laughed, the kind that makes you forget what year it is. And beneath it all, something was different this time. There was less nervousness, less dancing around the edges of their feelings. They were older now, more aware of how finite everything was. The years had carved softness and strength into both of them, and with that came a new kind of courage. At one point, as the night was winding down and people began to leave, they found themselves standing outside on a quiet balcony. The city hummed below, lights blinking like distant stars. A cool breeze moved between them, carrying away the last bits of small talk. Sandra rested her hands on the railing, staring out at the view, feeling the heaviness of regret wrap around her shoulders like a familiar coat. "You know," she said slowly, her voice barely above a whisper, "I used to have the biggest crush on you." She laughed quickly, trying to make it sound like a light confession, a nostalgic joke. But the words were too raw, too true. They hung in the air between them, fragile and electric. For the first time in a very long time, she didn't hide behind humor or professional distance. She just let the truth sit there, exposed and trembling. She didn't expect what he said next, or the way his answer would make her realize that all those years of silence might not have been the whole story. "I had a crush on you too." He said it so simply that for a moment she thought she'd misheard him. No build-up, no dramatic pause, just a quiet truth laid gently on the table between them. Sandra turned her head to look at him, searching his face for any hint of a joke, some teasing glint in his eyes. There was none. He was watching her with that same calm honesty she'd always admired, like he'd decided he was too old, too tired to keep dancing around something so obvious. "For a long time," he added, almost apologetically, as if the confession were somehow late. Her heart lurched. The balcony, the city, the murmur of distant traffic, all of it blurred for a second. She felt a rush of heat rise in her chest, not the excited flutter of a teenage crush, but the deep, aching realization of what might have been. All those years they'd spent telling themselves it was better not to risk it, that timing wasn't right, that work came first. And now, in one sentence, he'd pulled the curtain back. "Then why didn't you say anything?" she asked, the words escaping before she could soften them. There was no accusation in her tone, just a raw curiosity, an ache to understand whether fate really had been cruel or if they had done this to themselves. He looked down at his hands, fingers resting lightly on the railing. You," he said with a small, helpless smile. "You were shining, you were handling everything, the pressure, the interviews, the expectations, and I didn't want to be one more person asking something from you." He shook his head. "I thought you deserved someone stronger, someone less complicated." She stared at him, stunned. You thought you weren't strong enough, she asked, almost laughing at the absurdity of it. You jumped onto moving buses for a living, Keanu. He gave a quiet laugh at that, but his eyes stayed serious. Stunts are easy, he said. Being real with someone, that's the scary part. A beat of silence passed. She looked out over the city lights again, but her mind was trapped in the past. Back in that trailer, on that set, on that last day when they'd been inches away from the same confession and both too scared to make it. There was a strange comfort in knowing it hadn't been one-sided, but also a deep, twisting regret. Two people, both kind, both cautious, both too humble to believe they were what the other wanted. It was heartbreaking and painfully human. I thought the same thing, she admitted softly. I thought you were too good, too gentle. I was afraid I'd mess it up, turn something pure into something messy. So I convinced myself it was better to keep you as this, beautiful, safe what-if. He turned toward her then, fully, his shoulder almost brushing hers. The balcony light cast soft shadows across his face, highlighting the lines carved there by years of laughter and loss. We were very considerate cowards, he said, and the words were so honest they made her chest tighten. They both laughed, but there were tears in her eyes now, stinging at the corners. She blinked them away quickly, embarrassed, but he noticed. He always noticed. Without saying anything, he took a small step closer, close enough that she could feel his warmth in the cool night air. You know, he went on, voice gentle, I used to tell myself that if it was meant to happen, life would find a way to push us together. But life doesn't always push. Sometimes it just gives you an opening and waits to see if you're brave enough to walk through it. The words slipped under her armor. For years, she had turned their story into something almost magical in her mind. Fate, timing, stars that never quite aligned. Now, hearing him say it so plainly, she realized how much she'd hidden behind that idea. It was easier to blame destiny than to admit she'd been too scared to speak her heart. Do you ever regret it, she asked, voice barely audible, that we didn't try? He was quiet for a long time, the kind of silence that wasn't avoidance but careful consideration. I try not to live in regret, he said eventually. But yeah, sometimes I wonder, especially on the hard days. He exhaled, a soft, tired sound. But I also know you've built a life. I've built one. We became who we are because of all the choices we made, including the ones we didn't. His answer was kind, mature, painfully reasonable, and still, something in her rebelled against it. Because underneath all that wisdom was a simpler, more selfish truth. Part of her wanted to hear him say he still thought about it, still thought about her, in the quiet moments when no one was watching. What if we got it wrong? She whispered. What if we called fear fate and just let it slide? He searched her face, and for the first time that night she saw conflict in his eyes. Real, deep conflict. Not about how he felt about her, that part seemed certain, but about what it meant to open that door now after so much time, so many scars. You're one of the few people I never wanted to hurt, he said, his voice roughening. Not back then, not now. We're not the same kids on that bus anymore. No, she agreed quietly. We're the people who lived with the question. The wind picked up, tugging at her hair, carrying the city's sounds up to their balcony. A siren in the distance, a shout, a burst of laughter from the street below. Life going on, indifferent to the fact that two people high above it were finally saying all the things they should have said years ago. Inside, the event was winding down. Doors opened and closed, chairs scraped, glasses clinked. A staff member poked their head out onto the balcony once, saw them deep in conversation, and respectfully slipped away. Out here, it felt like time had stretched, like the universe had given them one suspended moment to finally be honest. Let me ask you something, he said suddenly. If we could go back to that day in your trailer, last day of Speed, and you knew I liked you and I knew you liked me, would you have done something different? She didn't even have to think. Yes, she said, the word breaking out of her with startling clarity. I would have asked you to stay, for coffee, for dinner, for something real. I would have been braver. He nodded, his jaw tightening slightly. Me too, he said. I would have stopped pretending timing was the problem when it was really me. His admission landed in her like a stone in deep water, sending ripples through memories, rewriting scenes that had sat untouched in her mind for years. They had both held themselves back out of kindness, out of humility, out of a belief that the other deserved better than whatever brokenness they were carrying. It was tragically noble, and with each passing year it had quietly turned into pain. Sandra swallowed, feeling her throat tighten. "So what do we do with that now?" she asked, almost to herself. "Just file it away as a lesson in courage we didn't have." He didn't answer right away. His gaze drifted out over the city, then back to her, as if he were weighing something fragile in his mind. In his eyes, she could see it. That same careful consideration he'd had years ago, only now sharpened by everything he'd lived through. There was warmth there, yes, and affection, but also a fierce protectiveness. Of her, of himself, of whatever strange, undefinable connection had survived all this time. "I don't want to turn our story into a regret," he said finally. "If we're going to be honest, then let's really be honest. Not just about the past, but about right now." Her pulse quickened. "Right now," she echoed. He nodded slowly. "Right now," he repeated, the words steady, deliberate, "because the truth is my crush on you didn't stay in the 90s. The air between them seemed to crackle, charged with a tension that was no longer hidden behind jokes or polite distance. For the first time, he wasn't just talking about memories or what-ifs. He was talking about the present, about feelings that had survived success, heartbreak, and the kind of time that usually erodes everything. She felt the ground shift under her, hope flooding in, fear rushing up to meet it. In that single sentence, he'd opened a door she wasn't sure she was ready to walk through, but had secretly longed for all these years. And as she looked into his eyes, seeing that same mix of courage and vulnerability she'd fallen for when they were both younger, a new, terrifying thought settled into her chest. This time, if she stayed silent, the loss wouldn't just belong to the past. It would be something she chose now. He waited for her answer without pushing, his eyes steady, giving her the space he hadn't given himself all those years ago. The city hummed below them, the world still spinning, but for once Sandra felt completely still. No cameras, no scripts, no handlers, just the one question she'd been running from her entire adult life. "Are you brave enough now?" Her fear rose up first, the old familiar voice that said, "You're busy, he's busy, it's too late, it's too complicated." But beneath it, stronger and quieter, was something else. The knowledge that time had already taken so much from both of them. Waiting had never protected them, it had only kept them apart. She took a breath and stepped closer, close enough to really see the years in his face, the softness in his eyes that had never gone away. "Then let's stop pretending," she said, her voice shaking just enough to prove it was real. "I don't want you to be a what-if anymore." The relief that crossed his features was almost painful to watch, like someone who'd been holding his breath for decades and was finally allowed to exhale. He laughed, a small, disbelieving sound, and shook his head as if amazed by their own clumsy, overdue courage. "So," he asked gently, "where do we start?" "Something small," she replied, smiling through the tears now gathering at the corners of her eyes. "Coffee, a walk, a conversation without cameras. We don't owe the world a story. We just owe ourselves the truth." He nodded, and for a moment they stood there, two people who had finally chosen to step through the door life had held open for them all along. There was no dramatic kiss, no fireworks, just the simple, profound act of deciding not to run away this time. Later, when she'd be asked in interviews if she'd ever had a crush on him, Sandra would laugh and admit it, letting the world think it was a sweet, harmless confession about the past. What they wouldn't know, what only the two of them would carry, is that the real story didn't end with a missed chance on a movie set. It began on a quiet balcony years later, when kindness and courage finally stood side by side, and two very human hearts chose, at last, to be brave.